Nangendef in my native language. Hello and welcome to thematic session 8, Leave No One Behind, Empowering the Most at Risk Through Social Protection. My name is Rohima Liklo, the first female mayor of Banjul, the capital city of the Gambia, and I am honored to serve as the moderator of this session. I want to begin by extending my profound gratitude to the organizers of this important gathering and the hospitality of the beautiful city of Berlin for hosting us. Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, disaster risk reduction is not simply running from hazards, but investing public and private resources in protecting people and assets. Social safety nets are a critical measure for reducing disaster risk, and yet the World Social Action Report 2020-2022 highlights that only 46.9% of the global population are effectively covered by at least one social protection benefits, whereas about 4.1 billion people have no access to social protection. Those left uncovered are often the most marginalized and at risk. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will build our collective understanding on how adaptive social protection can address intersectional vulnerability and reduce disaster risk. We will also discuss both the potential and actual contribution of adaptive social protection scheme in reducing inequalities, identifying threats, preparing for, and recovering from crisis. Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, in today's session, we are thrilled to have as panelists very distinguished experts with deep knowledge and experience in areas up for discussion today. Because of the constraint of time and the fact that I want this presentation to be an educative and interactive session between the panelists and the audience, I will give a brief introduction of each panel member. But first, allow me to explain the house rules and modalities of this session. I would like to urge you to put your phone on silent. If you are watching online and you wish to follow the session in one of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of the video window. Slido will be used for all the Q&A during this session. In-room participants can connect on slido.com using their mobile phones and insert the code that is shown on the room screen. For those following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Pools and Q&A on the right-hand side menu. Ladies and gentlemen, I now like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Dr. Dali Sambu Doro. Dr. Doro is joining us online from Alaska. She is the International Chair of the Inuit Sakopola Council, an NGO representing 180,000 Inuits from Chokota, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. She is affiliated with the University of Alaska Anchorage, where she served as an assistant professor of international relations. Her present title is Senior Scholar and Special Advisor on Arctic indigenous peoples. Dr. Doro is the Arctic region representative to the facilitative working group to the UNFCCC. Ladies and gentlemen, our next panelist to be introduced is Dr. Punky Sumadi. Dr. Sumadi is the Deputy Minister for Population and Environment at the Indonesian Ministry of National Development Planning. He is responsible for planning, policy coordination, and promoting issues on population development, employment, poverty reduction, social protection, as well as cooperatives and small and medium enterprises. Next to be introduced is Ms. Mercy Road. Madam Road is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the World Institute of Disability. She was recently named by Forbes magazine to their inaugural 50 over 50 impact list and by Women's E-News as one of their 21 leaders for the 21st century. Mercy has served in executive leadership roles for disability advocacy and public policy organization since 1995. Appointed by President Obama to the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency from 2009 to 2017, she established and directed the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination. Ladies and gentlemen, our next panelist to be introduced is Ms. Victoria Salinas. Madam Salinas is the acting Deputy Administrator for the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States of America. She has worked with communities across the United States and internationally to build resilience and recover after major disasters. Most recently, Madam Salinas served as the Vice President for Programs and Communication at the non-profit Fuse Corps, where she focused on strengthening the capacity of local government to address pressing community challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, our last but not the least panelist to be introduced is Ms. Deborah Comini. Madam Comini is the Regional Director of Unicef East Asia and the Pacific region. She started her Unicef career in 1991 and has worked in Indonesia, Cambodia, Nicaragua, North Macedonia, Venezuela, and as Deputy Regional Director for Latin America and Caribbean. She has also served as the UN Resident Coordinator in Mongolia. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our expert panelists for today's sessions. Please allow me now to pose our first question to Dr. Doro. Dr. Doro, joining us online. Dr. Doro, social welfare and the principles that should underpin it can reduce risk. This is true not only of natural hazards, but also anthropologic ones. The foundation of resilient societies include environmental stewardship, assurance of food security, health, community culture, and education. Can you please share with us what we can learn from the ways in which the Inuit Sakopola Council approaches risk and builds the resilience of your community? Thank you.
Thank you, Kuyanak. I greatly appreciate this opportunity. In response to your question, I think first I must say that Inuit have always been able to adapt to the environment in which they live, the environment in which they have a profound relationship with. Indeed, if one thinks of Inuit and the Arctic harsh environment, we have been able to adapt to this environment and also maintain our relationship with this, again, very harsh environment. I think this is a critical thing to understand, especially in the context of disaster risk. Also, we view our environment in an interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible fashion. Our entire ecosystem should be seen and understood, and is seen and understood in a holistic perspective. We understand that if you alter one element of our ecosystem, it has an impact on all other elements or parts or living beings within our ecosystem. And so in terms of disaster risk and reduction, we have to remember that we live in an interconnected and indivisible environment where we ourselves are members or species of this same environment. In addition, our knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, the power of Indigenous knowledge when it comes to adaptation and reducing risk and harm within our communities, it's important to honor, respect, and recognize the accumulated knowledge that Indigenous peoples have in relation to their environment. And again, this is a profound relationship. I also want to say that because of this profound relationship to our environment and ecosystems, our own firsthand observations and monitoring of what is taking place within our environment, including things like the impacts of climate change across our Arctic homelands. I want to also say that it's been quite significant for us to be engaged in various different intergovernmental and regional initiatives, including the Arctic Council. And in this regard, I think it's important to share that we have been involved in the work of the Emergency Preparedness, Prevention, and Response Working Group of the Arctic Council. And in this regard, we have made our own contributions to the work of this particular working group, but recognizing that all of the other working groups, again, in an interrelated fashion, are important to us. But emergency response, preparedness, and protection is crucial when we think about the Sustainable Development Working Group, the conservation of the Arctic flora and fauna, another working group, as well as monitoring and assessing activities. And these are 4 of the working groups of the Arctic Council. I think finally that it's important to say that the rights of Indigenous peoples have to be recognized and respected when it comes to all matters, including disaster risk and reduction. I think too often Indigenous peoples, their way of life is misunderstood, but more significantly, one of the important pillars of the United Nations is human rights. And in this regard, the human rights of Indigenous peoples also have to be taken into account in any discussion and in any dialogue concerning disaster risk and reduction. And in this regard, it means collaborating with Indigenous peoples, cooperating with Indigenous peoples, and consulting Indigenous peoples consistent with the rights that have been affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which UN member states overwhelmingly adopted September 13, 2007. When it comes to the issue of the recommendations that I would like to make, I'll speak more to this particular issue. So I hope that the few comments that I've shared provide some glimpse or some insight as to the world of Inuit as Arctic Indigenous peoples. Qianak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Doro, for your very interesting intervention and for joining us from Alaska. My next question is for Dr. Punky Sumadi. Dr. Punky, you will agree with me that Indonesia, sitting on the Pacific Ring of Fire, is highly exposed to natural hazards. At the same time, the country has built a solid foundation of social protection programs, including conditional cash transfer, education cash transfer, food assistance, labor market, and worker protection schemes. As recently, Indonesia has also started a system reform, which includes adaptive social protection. Can you please share with us how these social protection efforts and innovations contribute to the broader disaster risk reduction agenda in Indonesia?
Thank you, Rohi. We did rigorous monitoring and evaluation of the existing social protection programs. And then what we found there is actually 4 elements that we are working on. First is actually the institutional arrangement. We know that actually the interministerial coordination was still lacking at that time, so we strengthened this coordination work so that actually central governments knows what to do, and then we also ask the local governments to participate, because we understand and we really know that central government cannot do the work alone. So we need to have the local governments to work with us, because they have to work down to the community level. That's one thing. The second thing is that actually on the data and information, from the recent earthquakes occurred in Lombok and South Sulawesi, for example, we initiated a program to re-register and reissue civil registration documents for the impacted population. We also provide an emergency mainframe to provide backup for civil administration services during the recovery. The work is quite inclusive, that we can reach the most people at risk during those disasters. But we also understand that actually there is inclusion and exclusion error. So that's why we are now working on the work, what we call is the social economic registry, covering 100% of the population. And then it has started with the 95 villages, and this year we will expand it into 50,000 villages. And then there is another element that is important within the data information, is that actually interoperability function between the social economic registry and disaster risk data. This is actually what we provide to the community level, at the village level, all information about development, including the disaster risk information. The third one is actually program modifications. Not only we are working on the current existing social protection programs, but we also add some new programs. We also include, for example, using the recent financial technology to pay the benefit of the existing programs and the new programs because of the current pandemic situations. So, for example, the CCT, we are using fintech to disburse the payment to 8.5 million people, food stamp to 18.5 million beneficiaries, pre-employment card or the unemployment card to 12 million people, wage subsidy to 3 million people, and payment through post office and e-money system recently to cover about 15 million people. So in total, I think it is more than the population of UK that we provide the beneficiaries with the fintech system. And we also, the last one is actually the sustainable financing. What we do is that actually how we can finance all these programs, given actually that we have limited budget. So what we did is actually we issued a special law to allow the government to increase the deficit financing from 3% to 6% of the GDP. This will allow us for the next 3 years to increase the funding availability to finance our social protection programs. And then based on this new policy, we were able to set up a National Economic Recovery Fund. Yesterday in other rooms, actually, we talked about how we can set up a new fund and then we can allocate the funds according to the functions, according to each ministries or local governments. Exactly this is actually what we've been doing. So by working on this issue, we are able to have sufficient funds, and unfortunately, we are still struggling in finding financing mechanisms outside the public sector. For example, private microinsurance has not been available in the market. We started a few years ago, but it is not successful. We have farmers insurance and fishermen insurance, but it is still limited because the coverage is also very low, and the funding actually still comes from the central government. Even though we have laws stipulating that local governments is able to create local government bonds, especially to fund the DRR needs, for example, but it is still not being used by the local government. So I think within the next time in the future, we are able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sumadi, for sharing the great efforts of your country, which we can all learn from. Thank you so much, sir. Next, I would like to turn to Madam Roth. We know that the implementation of the SEDI framework requires all of society approach. People with disabilities face specific disaster risks that people without disabilities do not have to contend with. At the same time, social protection can play a key role in realizing the rights of persons with disabilities of all ages, providing them with an adequate standard of living, a basic level of income security, promoting their independence and inclusion by meeting their specific needs and supporting their social participation in a non-discriminatory manner. Social protection from a right-based approach must accommodate the needs of persons with disabilities. Traditional disability-related social welfare schemes have mainly focused on poverty rather than taking into account specific challenges faced by persons with disabilities, particularly active participation in education, access to health, and employment. Madam Roth, can you please share how social protection systems can be strengthened to reduce the disaster risk that persons with disabilities face?
Hello, friends. It is an honor to be with you in Bali and across the wonders of the internet. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the World Institute on Disability and a founder of the Global Alliance for Disaster Resource Acceleration. My organization is one of the world's oldest disability rights organizations, founded and continually led by people with disabilities for 40 years. Personally, I'm a disabled woman, married to a man with disabilities, mother of 2 adult children with disabilities, and grandmother of a fabulous 3-year-old who also has disabilities. We are all proud of our disability identity and our contributions to the resilience of our local, national, and global community. In fact, both of my children and my husband all join me in making significant professional contributions in emergency management and public safety. I've been focused on disability-inclusive disaster risk reduction and community resilience for over 20 years. I've been at the table since the first draft of the Sendai framework and at each global platform since Sendai in 2015. I would love to say at this midpoint in implementation of the Sendai framework that we have made great progress, but that would be untrue. In fact, for people with disabilities of all ages, who comprise at least 15% of the global population, our powerful words of inclusion throughout the Sendai framework have not been operationalized in any consistent or sustained way. This is in part because our social protection systems fail to focus on the leadership of persons with disabilities and disability-led organizations. And without us, incorrect assumptions are made, accessibility is neglected, and our communities remain unprepared for the next disaster. We're continually having to force our way to the table and prove our value. And without accessibility, physical and equally effective communication access, legitimate participation remains a barrier for many. So, who is being left behind? Why are they left behind? And what do we all need to do to join together to do something about it? Not as an act of charity, not only because we have civil, human, legal rights, not because you all have obligations, but because this is the only way to truly lower disaster risk and increase resilience for the whole community. I can tell you that millions of people are being left behind, and the outcomes are terrible and preventable. In the US, our emergency management system routinely enables the institutionalization of people with disabilities in disasters, rather than adequately ensuring public funds are used for accessibility in all alerts and warnings, evacuation, sheltering, health maintenance, temporary housing, and long-term recovery. This has included institutionalization during recent fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, and markedly throughout COVID. In fact, rather than working with disability-led organizations skilled in institution transitions so people can live more safely in the community, over 200,000 people with disabilities of all ages died from COVID after being unnecessarily left behind in congregate facilities. The efforts of disability leaders to collaborate with emergency managers have been repeatedly ignored with tragic results. Do you know about the efforts in your own community to provide effective communication access to public meetings, public events, civic activities? This includes sign language, real-time captions, material and alternate formats, easy read, pictograms, braille, large print. Is accessible transportation readily available? Are preventative health services and health maintenance resources available? Are they accessible? How about continuity of operations in disasters? What about accessible housing, which is always in short supply? Now ask yourself, if you had an accident or illness while you're here in Bali, and it affected your mobility, would you be able to go home? Could you get in the front door? Or you have steps? Are your halls wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair? How about your bathroom? Could you care for your own hygiene needs? Enter and navigate your bedroom? Could you go back to work? Would you have accessible transportation? What if you had a cognitive disability as a result of a head injury? To be clear, people don't go to nursing homes because they are old. They are institutionalized because they answered no to the questions I just asked. This happens every day, and it happens because their community really isn't resilient. If you live in a resilient community that is committed to accessibility and universal design, you will have a far better chance of not being left behind before, during, or after a disaster. So to be clear, investing in social protection, in accessibility, and inclusion are for the resilience of the whole community. One last point. We disability community leaders understand that you don't quite know how to do this. It's okay. Pass the mic, make room at the planning table, pay us if others are being paid. We have a lot to contribute. We want to be sure no one is left behind, including you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Marcy, for highlighting the key approaches we must all implement to ensure that no one is left behind. My next question is for Ms. Victoria Salinas. Madam Salinas, considering the goal of the SEDI framework, can you please share best practices and lessons learned when trying to achieve greater disaster-responsive social protection?
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be back here in Indonesia. I am at the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, and I was actually here back in 2005. I had just hiked Mount Rinjani when I came down and saw what happened in the United States with Hurricane Katrina, and it set me on my path to working in communities after disasters and now in resilience. And I'm excited to be here today to talk about a lot of the changes happening in the United States that are really supporting adaptive social protection and moving in the direction of the Sendai framework. FEMA's mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. Many of you might think about FEMA and think about the response phase, but the before disasters is a huge part of what we do. And traditionally, much of what is done in the United States has been done with an idea of treating everybody equally, which sounds good on the surface, but it doesn't get to the different needs people have in order to truly be resilient. And so with the Biden-Harris administration and at FEMA currently, some of our key priorities are around instilling equity as a foundation of emergency management, climate resilience, and ensuring that we're ready as a nation for everything that is coming. And so there's a couple things examples I wanted to bring to life, and what that means in terms of what we're doing now. One of our big initiatives is called Justice 40. And that concept is that we want, through our programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities and a whole range of other programs across the federal government, to make sure 40% of the benefits are going to disadvantaged communities. For those of you working in international development, that sounds like a no-brainer. Of course we should be focusing on disadvantaged communities. But in the United States, the way we've administered our programs hasn't always led to being able to really meet the needs of those communities. And as we take an approach that focuses on justice, on environmental justice, what we're seeing is that it's changing the way we do business. It's changing the way we take existing programs and ensure that we're creating awareness about them, outreach so people can apply, communities can access them, have the resources. And so we're seeing a lot of changes by taking that equity lens to the work that we're doing that is really building our capacity to support resilient infrastructure, green infrastructure, which is such a key part of a social protection system. We're also changing the way we look at insurance. FEMA runs our flood insurance program, a national flood insurance program. And imagine this, for decades, if you lived in the same neighborhood, but you had a mansion and I had a cottage, we paid the same premiums for flood insurance. That's actually not very just, especially if I am a more low-income resident. And so in the last year, we've changed that focus on equity to make sure that risk is priced based on your actual risk, not just because you're in the same area as somebody else. And so these are steps we're taking to really make sure that we're not taking a one-size-fits-all solution, but really trying to take risk-based approaches and make things like risk transfer mechanisms and insurance much more affordable for people as well. In the recovery space, we're seeing major changes as well. In many countries, clear title is a challenge. And one of the key parts of our social protection system post-disaster is to help homeowners rebuild. But traditionally in the United States and like many countries, not everyone has a deed that they could get through our legal system, either because they inherited property or they were excluded from the legal system for historic reasons. This past year, in our ability as a program and as a programmatic change, we changed the conditions of eligibility to get money to repair your home. That was something we could do by just realizing the systemic inequities created by our programs and making that change. And in the last 6 months, nearly 100,000 homeowners got assistance that wouldn't have got assistance otherwise. And that's by taking this consistent equities to what we're doing and really asking those hard questions. What does everybody need to adapt and to be resilient? And what are the barriers they're facing now? Another big shift for us, and we heard it from our colleague from Indonesia, is really trying to make sure people have good risk information, that they can understand their risk. And part of that has been ensuring that all the great research, the science that is out there is understandable at the community level so that people like mayors and city planners can make sure that they're doing work with respect to, and planning with respect to risk. But we've also realized that the future conditions need to be key to that as well. And so that's been another big area that we're focused on, is trying to make the future conditions data, the probabilistic, taking those global data sets and making them practical at the parcel level. And so again, the focus for us is really around doing this work through an equity lens, because that's what we believe is going to really yield that adaptive capacity that we need at the local level for the challenges of today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Salinas, for these very important points. Thank you so much. I turn now to Ms. Deborah Comini. We have heard how adaptive social protection schemes can address the root causes and systemic drivers of vulnerability and inequality in a sustainable manner and reduce the impact of disasters. Yet, with more than half of the world's population with no access to social protection, we have significant gaps which can exacerbate inequalities. Madam Comini, can you please share your thoughts on how social protection can be further leveraged to ensure implementation of the SEDI framework is inclusive and no one is left behind? Madam Comini.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Now, we all understand there is a direct link between poverty and marginalization on one hand, and the ability of families to prepare for, cope with, recover from shocks, whether they come from natural disaster, conflict, climate change. Social protection then comes in to protect people against poverty and marginalization and all the underlying vulnerabilities. Now, of all population groups, children need most protection than all, because childhood, those years, they set the tone, they set the stage for the rest of a person's life. That's easy to understand, but we don't always operationalize this. Yes, there are gaps in social protection. So what I'm saying is that when we set priorities to address these gaps, for social protection to really be able to support people when they really need it the most, it is important we start with children. Hence, we must first identify the groups of children that are systematically excluded, hence most vulnerable, and find the most effective ways to reach them. In the case of shocks and emergencies, the number of people in need is suddenly much higher. So we need to be able to expand for a period of time both the number of beneficiaries, its horizontal expansion, and the amounts distributed, vertical expansion. This means countries are most effective and most efficient if they invest in shock-responsive social protection systems in advance, as part of their preparedness and ensure that people and communities are prepared, hence are resilient ahead of the crisis. Traditionally, social protection has been basically designed to address ongoing poverty and exclusion, but we need to better integrate in the social protection mechanism a deeper understanding of disaster risk, including in producing the relevant evidence, in adapting policy and legislative frameworks, in the financing mechanism, in programs such as cash transfers, social insurance, subsidies, and also in the administrative systems that need to be ready to take action as soon as early signs of crisis start to emerge. Unicef is working on social protection systems with governments in more than 150 countries precisely to strengthen their shock responsiveness, to make sure social protection systems enhance the capacity of the poor, of the most marginalized, to prepare for future crises, while they also rapidly respond to disaster-related risks and crises just as they unfold. We have developed a simple tool that helps identify gaps of social protection systems in their readiness to respond in times of crisis. The tools has already been applied in more than 10 countries. You might have seen a presentation yesterday in the Ignite session that showed the tool. But now I would like to share one example from one country, Mongolia. In Mongolia, we have seen harsh winters, what are known as the Zood, becoming more frequent, more severe. Now, in 2016, there was a research on the lasting effects of Zood, the harsh winter, on the human capital development of children, and we found evidence of the negative lasting impact of climate-driven shocks on the education and the health of children. What did we find? That children are less likely to be enrolled in mandatory school 2 to 3 years after the shock, after the Zood. That they are significantly less likely to complete basic education 10 to 11 years after the shock, talking about lasting damage. Also, we observed lasting impact on the height of children 3 years after the shock, driven by income constraints, and this is a clear sign of malnutrition, specifically a clear sign of stunting. Based on these findings, in 2019, UNICEF worked with the Mongolian Ministry of Labor and Social Protection and one provincial government to pilot a shock-responsive social protection program specifically designed for children at risk of climate-related weather shocks. And the pilot was built on an already existing national social protection program, the Child Money Program, that was already reaching more than 90%, more than 96% of children throughout Mongolia. What it was now added was a rapid vertical expansion of the Child Money Program, a top-up, prior to the start of the winter season as an early action measure that would allow households with young children to prepare for winter, to purchase warm clothes, nutritious food, to improve insulation, and also to get better fuel for their homes. So this was all about harsh winters. But then COVID came. And all the positive experience and learning from this pilot was key to inform the response of the government of Mongolia to the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic nationwide, not just in the initial province. And as a result, the existing Child Money Program was scaled up 5 times across Mongolia for all children for 15 months, together with other fiscal measures. And the fact that the original Child Money Program was already reaching the majority of children in the country prior to COVID-19 helped the government reach very rapidly a very large number of children that the pandemic made in very urgent need of support. And I consider this a very, very good example of how social protection can be leveraged concretely to ensure implementation of the Sendai framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Komini. Interesting session. And thank you to all panelists. We will now turn to questions we have received online from our audience. Please continue to share your questions with us through Slido. Our first question is directed to Dr. Salinas and Dr. Doro. And it reads, how can big countries that are vastly distributed, like USA or the Arctic regions, overcome the challenges in implementing adaptive social protection? Dr. Salinas and Dr. Doro, please.
I'm happy to go first. So it goes to, a lot of that goes to institutional arrangements and how the governance system works for disaster risk management, resilience as a nation. And so in the United States, given how large it is, there's a partnership between the federal level and the state level governments that actually is grounded at the local level. And I'm sitting next to a mayor here, and it's very important in our system that at that local government unit that we're giving primacy to local needs as the foundation of our partnerships. And so that's what really enables in a large country us to create more adaptive measures, because it's all in turn to what the most local community needs and how that's articulated both through plans and then those needs met through the programs that we manage at various levels.
Dr. Doro?
I think that is highly relevant, especially in relation to the Arctic, which is a vast area that is sparsely populated. I think one of the key elements is the need for an inventory of even just the basic hardware that is available to individuals when a disaster emerges. Presently, it's very clear in the United States, as well as across Inuit Nunaat in Canada, as well as Greenland, certainly in Chukotka and the Russian Far East, that we don't have the hardware necessary to respond to a natural disaster, let alone anthropogenic disasters. Climate change is one example. I think that as far as recommendations, I think the need for a clear inventory of what exists, but even more importantly, outreach to the Indigenous peoples out there and on the ground, especially on the edge of the ice, where disasters can be far more acute. Our knowledge, our perspectives, our ability to traverse the terrain is important information for responding to disasters. And I think there is insufficient hardware, but that also has to be understood against the backdrop of the chronic infrastructure deficit that Inuit and other Arctic Indigenous peoples have faced as well. So the question is so important, and I hope that even the few comments that I've made underscores the level of need that exists not only amongst Arctic Indigenous communities and Inuit communities, but my guess is that this is the same condition for Indigenous peoples across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you both for your clear answers. And our next question goes to Dr. Punky. What are the lessons learned from developing the disaster management pooling phone scheme in Indonesia?
The most important lessons that I learned from so far is that actually disaster risk reduction pooling fund is actually still exclusive for the financing of the central government. And we don't like that, because we cannot maintain the sustainability of this financial resources forever. So that's why actually we're still struggling in trying to find out what is the best combination of different funding sources that we can develop, that we can mobilize, so that actually each party, community, private sector, and international organizations can work together hand in hand and then agree on, okay, this is the next steps to do, this is the procedures, this is actually the management system that we can agree on, and then we can have this kind of understanding. Yesterday, when I learned from the other session, actually the international funding sources is available, but the access to that funds is actually very limited. Information is very limited. Secondly is that actually capacity to use the funds, to disperse the funds, to manage the program itself is still lacking. Yeah, so human resources, training, workshops about how we can access international funds is also important. And this has to be localized. Not only the central government is able to provide the mechanism, but also how to translate what we know, the best practice from financial management, so that local government and the community is also having the same capacity. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sumadi. You are right, localization is key. The next question goes to Ms. Roth. Madam Roth, the question reads, what are the practices for local information about the participatory planning related to DRR in vulnerable communities?
Thank you for that question. So, our communities all need the same information, but we need it in a variety of formats. There are many people who, if they have the key information, they can not only take personal protective measures, but they can contribute to the readiness of the whole community. So time and again, we find that information is only provided in one format, when in fact we need it in easy read. We need it in multiple languages. We need Braille, we need large print. We need sign language interpreters, and we need for information to be actionable. Information has to be accessible to be actionable. And our vulnerability is not inherent in who we are as people with disabilities, as people who are poor, as whatever vulnerability might be considered. We are vulnerable when, in fact, the barriers have not been removed to equal access and full participation.
Thank you so much, Madam Roth, for that brilliant answers. Again, now I turn to Ms. Salinas. Ms. Salinas, the question reads, how are you working with NGOs and community organizations on your social protection system?
So we're working with civil society and NGOs in a number of ways in the United States. During disasters is perhaps where our partnerships are most mature with voluntary agencies, and we see really deep partnerships at the grassroots level to help meet the needs of disaster survivors. And so that's a very mature relationship and partnership. What we're finding in the pre-disaster space, especially as we move into the conversation about disaster risk management and climate adaptation, is that who our partners are is expanding. Often for disaster risk management, it's been more emergency organizations who care about disaster preparedness. But what we're finding is that the entire environmental justice community is filled with incredible organizations who've been working on climate issues, on environmental justice issues in our most vulnerable communities for decades. And so as we work to bring better information to communities and help them take action on risk, we're actually deepening the partnerships we have in the pre-disaster space with a whole range of new types of organizations who've been working in an adjacent area, but who we're now formalizing our partnerships with.
Thank you very much. Salinas, once again, this question is for you. What are best practices in empowering older people, especially those with disability and women, who are often invisible through social protection?
In terms of best practices, and I'm sure some of my other colleagues here on the stage can speak to that, when it comes to empowering women in particular, one of the things that we found is that a lot of it comes back to the local level participation and really having community engagement that enables all people to participate. And what we've been finding in the United States, and a lot of our cities have actually been at the forefront of this as they develop resilience strategy, adaptation strategies, is shifting the framework on what community engagement entails. I think many of us have probably been to workshops during the day where working women can't attend if they've got jobs and are doing things. And so there's a lot of different approaches to really expanding the opportunities for participation so people can be part of identifying and defining their community's needs. And then the other thing I wanted to raise up and actually build off what Marcy was talking about in terms of materials and making sure that engagement is in different formats is really understanding people's various needs. Marcy talked a lot about the different formats. One of the things we found at FEMA is that a lot of our materials to engage people and prepare people was done with a certain image of what people are. And in the United States, it was middle-class families to a large extent. And so one of the things we've been doing to try and empower and additional types of people with different vulnerabilities is come up with preparedness measures that are no cost or low cost. And so looking at people's needs and understanding their unique backgrounds is a big part of what empowering and building capacity means to us.
Thank you very much. I think I want to direct these questions to all panelists, starting with Sumadi, please. And it's the same question, but I read, what are the best practices in empowering older people, especially those with disability and women who are often invisible through social protection? Yes.
We need to include them in the very beginning of the work, especially when we are planning the programs itself. I remember during the pandemic, we have many focus group discussions, seminars, including the women disabilities group of people with disabilities, to really understand actually what is happening with the COVID-19, for example, how they are impacted, how we can help them out, how you can help us reach out those who cannot be identified on the radar. So starting from this, actually, then we work together with them on funding about the programs so that we can make sure that actually it will reach them. We work with the local government, we work with the media, we work with the universities to help us get the programs to them. This is actually what we have done so far.
Thank you. Madam Roth, please.
We have a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And more recently, we've amended it to very simply, nothing without us. And regardless of where that planning is happening, whether it's at the local level, at the national level, at the global level, we don't want people speaking for us. That's where things fall apart. Give us the mic. Give us the opportunity with other marginalized groups of people, I think we've made more progress than we have with people with disabilities. Lots of people are still speaking for us, and we will never achieve the resilience that everyone needs until people with disabilities are at the table, taken seriously, able to fully participate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Punky. There is another question here for you. What are the lessons learned from developing the disaster management pooling fund scheme in Indonesia? What are the lessons learned from developing the disaster management pooling fund scheme in Indonesia?
Actually, the lessons learned is that actually we have to get the arguments up to the highest level. The president should know. Actually, dealing with disaster just like COVID-19, it's a big thing, very big thing. So we have to have the drive from the president. So that's why we have the law. Just we released 3 weeks after we declared the first pandemic case in Indonesia, which is actually close to my house, about 1 kilometer from my house. But 3 weeks later, we have this special law stipulating that the government should do interministerial coordination, central local government coordination, and with the work with the people. This is actually what we have done so far. And then we also understand that actually because of this needs money, we have to set up some kind of governance, financial governance to disburse the funds. So that's why we need to include also the General Auditor's Office. We need also to include the law enforcers in this work. And then we also have to include the parliaments as well, because they need to understand what it is for, how we are going to use it, what kind of governance level that we are to maintain. So this is actually the framework that we are setting up, and then we provide them and we communicate them with the international market. So that's why we can sample international bonds issued, and then it will be bought from private sectors outside Indonesia. So that's why we can get the fund coming to Indonesia. But again, the homework is actually how we can set up a good concept, a good governance that actually be bought by the highest level of the government.
Thank you very much. And another question, this question goes to Dr. Doro. What practices have you seen that can be successful in supporting differential vulnerability across jurisdictions? Social insurance is bound by national borders, if it exists at all. What else can you point to us?
Thank you for the question. First, allow me to say and build upon the comment that was just now made about good governance, as well as a comment that you made, Madam Moderator, about a human rights framework. And this applies to some of the questions that have already been asked. I just wanted to indicate that Indigenous peoples and the exercise of their right of self-determination, the exercise of their right of self-government, have governments and political institutions of their own. And to a great extent, it really depends on the recognition of and the respect for such political institutions, their rights, their status, and their role, and inclusion of them, much in the same way as our colleague addressed as far as persons with disabilities. And that human rights framework is so important in all of these discussions, including the one posed by the question just now about especially Indigenous peoples like the Inuit, who transcend national borders and national boundaries, that our membership, our direct blood relations are in the Russian Federation, the Russian Far East, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And here, we need coherence and coordination across the whole of this Arctic region. Coherence and coordination at the international level, coherence and coordination at the national level, but also at the micro level where Indigenous communities sit and observe and are impacted by either the natural disasters or the anthropogenic caused activity. I think that this is an important dimension that's often forgotten, certainly in our context, as well as the context of the Sami, who transcend national borders, Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world who do as well. I think that the element of inclusion and not after the disaster, but here and now, in preparation for the kinds of disasters that we already face, like the coastal erosion that we're seeing within our communities, the need for relocation of our communities due to the impacts of climate change. There are a host of other things. And in the Arctic, I can foresee with the increased vessel traffic caused by the loss of sea ice, that there is greater potential for greater risk, and it's not a possibility, it's more likely a probability. So our voices and passing us the mic as well is equally as critical. But I think I want to finally say that we have to recognize that Indigenous peoples are distinct peoples. They're not, I don't put them in the category of civil society, nor in the category of local communities, but we have a distinct legal status, distinct rights, and a distinct role to play in all of these dialogues. Thank you, and sorry for speaking at length on this.
Thank you so much. I now turn this question to Madam Komini. How to address gender-based violence, risk factor in social protection assessment and service? How to address gender-based violence, risk factor in social protection assessment and service?
From a Unicef perspective, I would start addressing gender-based violence within social protection, within shock-responsive social protection, starting with childhood. We need to start with the detection of violence within the household. And we need to have social protection systems that reach the household level with those lenses on. We need to have, for example, across social protection systems, specialized officials, specially trained, competent government, local government, social workers who know how to recognize those signs, because we cannot have a social protection system, a shock-responsive social protection system that remains neutral, that is not able to, again, take advantage of having outreach to the household level without also addressing signs of violence. But for this, it takes specialized knowledge, it takes a social workforce that's very specifically trained. So that is where I would start from.
Thank you very much. I think I want to direct just one more question to Dr. Komin. That is how to integrate all data collected by stakeholders, including CSOs, to create one meaningful data map to provide social protection to who are in use, to those who are in use. Okay, let me repeat it. How to integrate all data collected by stakeholders, including CSOs, to create one meaningful data map.
that this is a big challenge, but this again, there needs to be intentionality in the way we produce our databases used for decision-making processes, and making sure those databases have access to the information that is collected from the local level. Now, there are some examples that I would like to put on the table of data collected also by young people. So we have some platforms that also Unicef has been supporting to make sure that the perception of reality and the way reality is affecting young people and children is that put on platforms that have a formal connection to government systems that are then used to take decisions. Again, it's similar to my previous answer, but it boils down to it's not something we improvise. It takes intentional preparation, it takes investment, and we need to build that in from the start. We cannot improvise it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those brilliant answers from the panelists. I think we are now coming to the end of today's excellent session, but before we close, I would like to ask each speaker to make one recommendation and reflect briefly on what makes them hopeful from today's discussion. And on that note, I want to start with Madam Comini. Madam Comini, the floor is yours.
What makes me hopeful? COVID-19 has been a global tragedy, but we have learned a lot. And what we have learned is actually what makes me hopeful. And now we need to build on that learning. We need to build on that awareness, that momentum, and continue to build on shock responsive social protection systems that are also well understood by the public and accessed by the public. Now, during the pandemic, in different countries, we saw that when there is political will, social protection emerged as an incredible tool to address development and humanitarian action, also for quite long periods. We still have gaps, but we see that overall, despite fiscal constraints, despite competing priorities, most governments now have learned it. They recognize much better the central role of social protection in addressing vulnerabilities. And also, people are more aware of it. People are demanding it, they're expecting it from their governments. That makes me hopeful. But now we need to go beyond this, because social protection cannot be highlighted only during a crisis or seen as a short-term mitigation response. We need to treat it as a pillar of overall resilience building, DRR, climate adaptation, and this was also articulated in the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this applies across all sectors as social protection relates to all the priorities outlined in the Sendai framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Comini, a very brilliant recommendation. Now I turn to Ms. Salinas. Please share your recommendations.
So the question is, what makes me hopeful? And when I think about all the programs that we have in the United States, all the programs and efforts you all have, there's so good work happening already. And so as I think about the challenges we still have ahead, there's a lot of power that we have to improve what we're already doing. There are changes we've made, several that I mentioned today, that were in our ability to do. We didn't need new money. We didn't need new authorities from our Congress. We just needed to understand what people's true needs were and what their barriers are to accessing resources, investing in their resilience, and we could take it. And so that's what makes me hopeful, is that there are so many good programs that with some slight changes, with some adaptation, with better partnerships, with understanding whose program, if we work together, or which agencies, which ministries through partnership can do more, that we can achieve a lot together, and that the challenges we're better understanding, we are equipped to deal with. But it does require open to understanding the barriers to all kinds of people people. And today we heard both from some Indigenous leaders and disability rights leaders. Those are the voices that we need to hear, as well as many other communities with different types of vulnerabilities, so that we're reducing the barriers and doing what we're already doing, but in a way that is truly investing in resilience.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Salinas. Now we turn to Ms. Mercy Roth. Ms. Mercy, the floor is yours.
People with disabilities are usually masters at problem solving. We have lots of experience in anticipating and solving problems in emergencies and disasters. My recommendation is to build your network of disability experts who can assist you in your efforts to move from thinking of people with disabilities as a liability in your disaster work, and instead use our expertise as an asset. What makes me hopeful is that there were 300 or so global platform attendees who indicated that they have disabilities in their registration. Active leadership of people with disabilities and the many visible and less visible accessibility efforts of UNDRR to include and accommodate us gives me tremendous hope that we will continue to be welcomed and taken seriously. That benefits everyone.
Thank you, Madam. One recommendation, please, Dr. Punky Sumadi.
We lost our status of middle-income country to lower middle-income country due to COVID-19 disaster. During the first few months of the pandemic, many think tanks, international agencies, international development banks predicted that actually our poverty rate will go from 9.7% to more than 12%. In fact, our poverty rate last year is about 10.14%. Unemployment would also rise from 5.2% to more than 9%. In fact, our unemployment rate is now 6.5%. These developments were due to social protection programs. We adapt the policies, we change the policies, we change the modalities, we change the governance, we increase the coverage, things like that. It's a painful process, but we have to work together. The government, the national government cannot do alone. We have to work with the people. We have to work with those who are the most vulnerable, because we need to reach them. We need to include them. We want them to be able to be in the driving seats together with us. This is actually what we've done so far. Is it successful? Of course not. So that's why we improve the way we convey our message, the way we collect data, the way we inform our policies to them. This is actually the big homework that we are working on. We also work with international partners to help us deal with the impact of the DRR through adaptive social protection. We learn how to improve funding sources, program implementations, and governance. But most importantly, we make records of what we have done so far, so that larger international communities and our future generation can learn from what we are experiencing now, even though it is painful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sumadi. And last, but by no means the least, joining us online from Alaska, please, Dr. Doro, share your final thoughts.
Once again, Kayanak, thank you for the opportunity. I think that it's important to say that historically Indigenous peoples have been at risk. If you think about the colonization, the domination, exploitation, subjugation of Indigenous peoples historically, and the policies that have been perpetrated against Indigenous peoples, this created huge risk and quite frankly, social insecurity. And so there's a lot to build back in terms of resilience and gaining our space and our intellectual place in all of these different dialogues. I think that one of my key recommendations to especially UN member states, but society at large, is genuinely committing to respecting and recognizing and implementing the rights that are affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the International Labor Organization Convention on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This trilogy of international human rights instruments is crucial to ensuring that there is respect for and recognition of our knowledge in areas that I think are unforeseen by many when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And I'm hopeful about the ability of governments to meaningfully engage Indigenous peoples, to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples, and would simply like to applaud the fact that the government of Canada has adopted national legislation, now a law, a national law, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indeed, there are challenges. Everyone's still trying to figure out how that can effectively be done in full collaboration and consultation with Indigenous peoples. Yet it's a hopeful sign in terms of a democratic government taking good governance to a real space and place that allows Indigenous peoples to work with government in partnership to design many things, not only those related to disaster risk reduction. Finally, I would like to say that it's my hope that governments, corporations, all other individuals across society and civil society take the effort at a personal and perhaps a professional level to curb the impacts of climate change that we're facing across the Arctic. It is no secret to anyone that the Arctic is warming at 3, perhaps 4 times faster at the rate than anywhere else in the world. And we're the ones, we, the Inuit and other Arctic Indigenous peoples, are the ones that are going to suffer from this particular disaster. We are already suffering from this particular disaster. So I think we need to take on urgent steps across the board, not only in relation to climate change, but a whole host of things that have become more acute in the face of COVID. Now, this crisis that we see in terms of great power competition and the geopolitical and geostrategic issues that we're facing. When I left one of the communities, the price of fuel, the price of gas was $16 a gallon. $16 a gallon. If you think about a person that needs to hunt, fish, or harvest to ensure the food security for their family or their community, how does one move ahead? So I mean, this is a reality. These are real conditions. How do we avert disaster in that particular context? Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope that I've been able to share some perspectives that need to be uplifted in every one of these particular dialogues, including making the Sendai framework and its references to Indigenous peoples a reality. So, Qianak, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doro. What a great recommendation from our team of experts. Amazing. Thank you once again, dear distinguished panelists, and thank you everyone for joining today's session in person and online. I am so we have learned a lot from our experts, and fortunately for me, I have a lot to take back with me to the Gambia. the capital city, and by extension Banjul, the capital city of the Gambia known as West Africa. I have learned a lot from these experts, and I have so much to take along. I now close today's sessions, and once again, thank you again for joining us. Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.